Hi, welcome. That's the spirit. So I lost my voice yesterday, and I had a full day workshop, and I had to shout my way through the day because, I had to finish the workshop somehow. So I asked several people how to cure that, and they all had different opinions, so I tried all of them. It had medication in it, some weird stuff that I had to take, whiskey, yeah. So something of that seemed to have worked because my voice is back. I might sound a little bit rough today, so excuse me for that, but at least I can speak, okay? Which brings us to exactly this topic, yeah, authorization, because also many people have different opinions about authorization, yeah, which was a perfect segue, I think, yeah. So the background story of this talk is, so I'm not sure if you know the work I'm doing, but I'm a security consultant, but security is a broad field these days, right? So I'm mostly specializing on what is called identity and access control, so basically authentication and authorization. And I'm working on this open source product called Identity Server. It's a open source implementation of OpenID Connect and OAuth, which are the most popular, the most popular protocols these days for implementing authentication and access control. So, and when you are doing that for a long time, like working with companies and with developers and trying to figure out what's the best way to get their authentication story right, it turns out at some point it's pretty much cookbook style, right? So you're listening to the scenarios and architecture, and you're pretty, you can say, okay, do this and do that, and it's once you've done it often enough, it becomes easy. I guess that's for everything you're doing in your life, but since I have the luxury, in quotation marks sometimes, to do that full time, yeah, that's all I'm doing really. It becomes easy at some point, yeah. What's not so easy, I think, even after many, many, many years of doing my job, is finding the best way, once you then have the authentication done, figuring out how to implement your logic around and what is this user allowed to do in my application, right? So I think that's a much more challenging problem than authentication, because, as I said, authentication is pretty much, once you've done it, it works, yeah? So, so for many, many years, people that are using our libraries and frameworks said like, oh, can't you just create another library, authorization server or something like that, and we just do, app.use authorization and we're done, right? And it turns out there is no way to turn authorization into a turnkey solution, yeah, because it's so application specific, yeah. So it turns out authorization is hard. And the hardest part about it is, I guess, that when you talk to 10 people, you will get 15 different opinions on how to implement it. Yeah? So, some people like roles, some people like permissions, some people think of like a resource-based style where maybe you have access control lists that are attached to objects in your application. That is typically inspired by how Windows does it, right? Where you have an access control, an ACL that hangs off a file or a directory, and you have all these complexities around inheritance and orphans and all these things. You approach authorization differently if it's about queries versus commands, right? So a command is typically something like, I want to do something, am I allowed to do that? Yes or no, and then either succeed or fail. Whereas queries are more like, give me all the things from that table, but only the ones that the user is allowed to see. Yeah, and again, how you filter that is often very specific to the data access technology you're using, and what you want to avoid is getting all the data and then filtering it in the front end, right? That would be a bit of a security fail. So we've been looking at all these things for many, many years. So when I say we, it's Brock and myself. We have this little company that does this style of consulting and software development. And we try to find a pattern over the years, right? So is there something in there that can be turned into a framework? Yeah? But yeah, as I said, it's often very application specific. The other thing that hits you sometimes when it's too late is you realize that actually the authorization rules you're just trying to implement are actually business rules, right? Where you know, it looks like authorization, it walks like authorization, and it talks like authorization, but it isn't authorization. It's more like something that is very, very core to your business, and I will have an example of that later on. And has anyone ever tried to use this thing called XAML? No one? Ah, two? So you can see from two hands going up, it's not very popular. Yeah. XAML stands for Extensible Access Control Markup Language. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard to pronounce. It's hard to use. And it's an XML, as you can imagine, XML vocabulary to model authorization. And they tried to find this universal answer to all the problems in the world. And I guess you agree it's very complicated. Exactly. So they try to find the universal answer to all the problems around that spectrum, and it turns out sometimes well, most of the time it was much harder to now formulate your problem in XML than just write a couple of lines of C# code, I think. Yeah. Anyways, so basically, so my starting point typically is this architecture, right, where you have a couple of clients, like browser-based, native users. Some users use the same application. Some users switch between applications, maybe even throughout the day. You have like server-to-server style communication. You have applications and APIs, and APIs calling APIs, and all these permutations of things that make our today's architecture interesting. Yeah. And the very first thing you have to solve before you can even think about authorization, and that's probably my first advice to you, is before you can think about authorization, think about authentication first, right? Because you need to find a way in that architecture how you can provide a stable identity for every user across every application and service he's using. Yeah? If you don't have that up front, the whole authorization question is moot. Yeah? So what you want is that this guy, Bob or Alice or whoever, regardless of how he comes into your system and at the end ends up somewhere, is always the same Alice and always the same Bob, right? And that is pretty much a solved problem. You're using the security token service pattern for that, right? Where you abstract all your authentication into a single box, make authentication a service in your architecture, use the established protocols for that, OpenID Connect, OAuth, to connect your different parts to the system into this thing. And then your users and your clients will have a one-stop shop for all the authentication needs, and your users will get the benefit of single sign-on and single sign-out and all these things, right? So once you have that, the next question will be now, okay, so now we have that, what is this guy allowed to do in my application? And now, there's this desire that this is like a central service as well, right? So, and people look at the architecture and say, oh, we have a central service, right? We have this thing called the identity provider. So why not just use this guy to also distribute our authorization rules to our APIs and client applications, right? So this guy creates tokens. So why not stuff our authorization data into these tokens? Yeah. As a side note, an identity provider creates identity tokens. They are not called authorization tokens. There's actually a good reason why authentication and authorization are two different words. Yeah, because they are two different things, right? So we see so I do a lot of code reviews where I come to a customer that started implementing Identity Server, and I see them extending the system in a way where they start, depending on who the client is and who the user is and what you're trying to talk to, stuff authorization data into claims. okay? And what is a claim? Well, a claim describes the identity of a user. It doesn't describe what he's allowed to do, right? You're conflating two things here. Authentication, which is this guy, versus authorization, which is this guy. And this might look manageable to start with, but the more clients you get, the more services you get, the more complex your system gets, you will have a big ball of mud at some point, which is really, really hard to get rid of. This is a good example of an overloaded security token that some people produce with their identity system, okay? So there are some obvious things in there. Authentication metadata, like, who's the issuer and how long is this token valid for and where can you use that token and how did the user authenticate and so on. And then there are actually real identity data in there as well. What's the user ID, what's the name? And then it starts to get problematic, yeah? So authorization data, like he can delete data. Okay, cool. He can manage customers. He can change treatment plans. So this is all inspired by a customer I have that builds hospital software. So maybe you know Doug Ross. And then there's roles, okay? So these are clearly, that's authorization data, and I don't think that should be in an identity token. And I'll tell you in a second why. Roles is kind of like a gray line. Yeah, so in my mind, there are identity roles and there are authorization roles. So for example, again, let's take a look at my customer. Each user in that system has exactly one role, and it's called either doctor, nurse, or patient. And there's no situation where a doctor will be a nurse or vice versa. Okay, so that role clearly describes the identity of that user. Whereas approver, what does that mean? What can this person approve? It probably depends on which API you're talking to, right? So the model in OAuth is unlike in WCF, for example, is not that you get one access token per API you're talking to, but you're getting one access token for all the APIs you want to talk to, right? So now let's take this token and use it here. Remember, this guy is an approver. In which API? Right? He might be an approver in the, he might be allowed to change the treatment plan in the oncology department, but not in the cardiac department, right? He's not qualified for that. Yeah, and stuffing in these permissions into your tokens, that's just something that doesn't belong there, in my opinion. B, what happens if this data becomes ambiguous, right? Even the role approver, right? That he might be an approver in the patient data API, but not in the cardiac API. And then what do you do? Like start prefixing those claim types with cardiac.approver, and I don't know, that's madness, yeah? So is there anyone in the room who ever tried to do that? Like mix identity tokens together with access, access rules? Yeah, don't be shy. I did it as well. And you have to learn the hard way. It's easy to put a claim into a token. It's very hard to get rid of it again because some people already have a dependency on it, right? The tokens shape, the types of claims in the token, they become an explicit contract between the issuer and the consumer, right? The consumer assumes that these claims are present and they have a certain meaning. And if you realize, oh, I did a mistake, changing the meaning of claims and changing the types of claims requires an overall, operation in your architecture to make sure no one doesn't have a wrong understanding of that, right? So this is troublesome, okay? And I had many discussions with customers. They started with a small system, and they said like, yeah, but this works for us, yeah. And then 3 years later, they came back and said, yeah, you were right. Now we have these 20 more APIs, and we have to refactor everything because now we did the mistake. We conflated authentication with authorization. Okay, so a couple of more things why I think this is a bad idea. your identity system, yeah, can be a very effective service because it only does one thing. It authenticates the user, and it's all about identity. Your identity system shouldn't have intimate knowledge of an application-specific authorization concern, right? Why would the authentication system know that this guy is allowed to change a treatment plan at this API? It's not the job of the identity system, yeah? There's this rule in security: do authorization as close as possible to the resource you are trying to protect. And that's definitely not the identity system, okay? Another thing is, tokens are a very handy data structure if you have to transmit something that shouldn't be altered, like your identity, for example. But the only way to get a new token and updated data is to go back to the token service. And that typically requires re-authentication of the user or similar things, yeah? And let's say your permissions change. Your permissions, identity is typically something that doesn't change, at least not during the duration of a user session, right? You're not changing your first name every half an hour. But permissions might change, yeah? So somebody might take away a permission from you or give you a new permission. And if the permissions are in the token, the only way to get a new permission is to re-authenticate with the system, yeah? Windows has exactly the same problem. Yeah, when an admin puts you into a Windows group, you have to log off from Windows and log back in because these groups are in the Windows token. Or even worse, let's say an admin put you by accident into the admin group. Now he has to back you. Yeah? Log out, please, so you're not admin anymore, right? It's not a good fit. I think I said it a couple of times now. So my conclusion is this. You have to have two things. One is the identity system, and one is the permission system, and that together becomes authorization, okay? So what do I mean with that? So in my mind, you have to introduce another infrastructure component, and let's just call it the authorization provider, okay? As being complementary to the identity provider. So the idea is one guy knows about identity, and one guy knows about the permissions of the user, okay? And if this is really like central in the way of there's only one in your company, or if there are multiple of these providers that know about, only parts of your applications, doesn't really matter. The point is they are separate. Yeah, that's the main point of this slide here. And the way I see that is this. So the first thing you do is you authenticate your user, right? So you do an authentication request, you authenticate the user, maybe you authenticate the client as well. And you do an authentication request, you do a token request, and what comes back is the identity token that describes the user, right? And now the really important thing is now for me that now there's a separate service that you can talk to, and you have the notion of give me the client-specific permissions, right? So I am client X, this is Dominic, give me the permissions that he has in my application, right? I am the oncology API, yeah? Give me the permissions that Dominic has in my API. Okay, so basically what this authorization provider really is, it's a service that knows about applications, and you can have more than one application, and the way you cut them depends on your architecture, right? You could have front-end applications that typically have different authorization requirements than back-end style applications, right? Your UI typically cares more about, like, do I show this button or not, or do I, whatever. Whereas your back-end services typically care much more about, like, is he allowed to change that plan, right? You're only doing authorization in the front end for usability, and you're doing authorization in the back end for security, right? They are different things. So, long story short, when Brock and I sat down and said, okay, now after many years of listening to our customers and so on, let's prototype something that we think can work, right? And I'm not claiming it works for everyone. That's what I learned in authorization. It's so specific to the customer, but we think it works for many people. And we call that, like lack of a better name, I guess, the authorization provider. And the idea is it has, do I have a picture here? Oh yeah, it has in addition to that, in addition to that service, it has an admin UI, right? At some point, you can hand over the permissions to someone who is non-technical, or at least not a developer, right? And they can change basically the rules using some UI. I don't have a UI, right? I'm a developer. I do my stuff in code. But for a real product that might be something that we're working on, you would have a UI that then you can, per application, can define the permissions and roles of that user. So roughly how that looks like, that's our prototype. Is you have two endpoints. One is the management endpoint. That's what the API, what the admin UI would talk to. And the way we think is, if you want to generalize things on what are most people are doing, it boils down to they're doing roles and permissions. Yeah, roles more for the coarse-grained style. Yeah. Well, there are 3 levels, I think. Yeah, one is the level of, is this user allowed to open or to use that application at all, right? That would be like the very first check. Then the second check is something like, okay, this user has roles that are global to the organization. That would be another level, one level deep into how you would describe permissions. And then per application, there are application-specific roles, and there are basically roles to permission mappings, right? So if you are in the role of a doctor, you can prescribe medication. Yeah, if you're in the role of a nurse, you can take the temperature of a patient, something like that, okay? The way we think about it is there are static mappings and dynamic mappings. So static mappings could be, here's your list of users, and you say user number 1, 2, and 3, they are doctors, right? And user 5, 6, and 7, they are nurses, right? But this whole system becomes a little bit more interesting if you take this idea of claims transformation, where you not only send the user ID in, but you send whatever you get back from the identity system, right? So you authenticate that user, and that might be using your local, your local provider, or maybe this is an external user, right? He comes in via, like a business to business. Hospitals work together. You could do federation between them. So whatever claims you're getting back from your identity system, yeah, the subject ID, a role, other stuff, can be used in here to dynamically put them into roles. Right? So maybe if he has a Gmail account, he must be a contractor, yeah. Or if he, I don't know, yeah. This external system sent us he's a specialist in oncology, so we will give him oncology-specific roles without you having to statically define who is allowed to do what. You can, based on the input data, map him to to roles of permissions. Okay. So let me show you that. So what we have as a prototype, as I said, is we have a library. It's the authorization server, and we have a host that hosts that logic, right? So it turns out this is just an ASP.NET Core application, a web API, and we are adding the authorization engine here. And you are loading the configuration from somewhere. In our case, that's code, but it could be a database or whatever. And the way the configuration looks like basically is, it has this notion of an application. Yeah, so, and again, what an application means to you depends on your architecture. It could be the hospital, or you want to maybe subdivide it into the departments, for example, or per app, up to you. Right, and we have this notion of roles and permissions. So we have a role called doctor, a role called nurse, and a role called patient. And we have permissions like prescribe medication that is mapped to the doctor role and the nurse role. Yeah, or perform surgery is only the doctor, right? That makes sense. Request morphine is for the patient, I guess. Yeah. Now the interesting thing is this: are so-called conditions. So how do we associate, we are calling. How do we associate those users with those permissions or roles dynamically. So you see here we have something called a subject condition, which basically really means user number 1 and user number 2, they are doctors, right? Whereas this here means if the identity system sent us a role called doc, dynamically assign him to the doctor role in the application, okay? Same idea here, 11 and 12 are nurses, or you're sending a nurse role from the identity system. And this here is patients, right? And that is an example of a more dynamic thing where you have an expression, yeah? So it turns out, if you have a claim of type sick, you're a patient, okay? And we have some people in there, they are very sick, okay? So that's basically the configuration, if you like. And again, imagine a fancy graphical user interface on top of that, right? So let's start that. Okay, so that's just an API. There's not much to see here. And we have like a simple test application. Here's an account controller. And you see basically we can log in with three people. Alice is subject number 1 and Bob is subject number 11. So based on our configuration, Alice is a doctor and Bob is a nurse, okay? And all the other people are very sick, okay? So if we log in here now in this application, and that's just a mock-up really, how you do authentication is not really part of this discussion. This could be local or Active Directory or Azure AD or OpenID Connect in general, whatever. But yeah, here's our login. So we see when we log in with Alice, we have a claim called subject 1, okay? If we log in with Bob, I guess that's not very surprising. We have a claim called subject 11. And if we log in with Brock, since Brock is not here, maybe he's sick, right? So that's how that works. So now, how do we, as an application, connect to such an authorization provider? And again, it's not that I'm telling you this is the best way in the world to do that. It's just what we came up with, and I hope you are inspired by the pattern at least, yeah? So a modern way of doing that probably would be, you're providing a client library that sits in your client application, and the way we do that's ASP.NET Core. We just add an authorization provider into the DI system. You specify, okay, I am the hospital application, right? The context is very, very important, as I mentioned earlier. You probably will get different permissions for Bob depending on if you are in application 1 or application 2, yeah? And that is the URL where the central authorization provider sits, okay? And then in our home controller, we can take a dependency on the authorization provider client that comes from this DI registration. Okay, and then in our secure method here, we can do things like, await client.get authorization async, and we pass in the user, yeah, and that could be your current user, but the nice thing here is about, for unit testing, you can pass in any claims principle you like. But yeah, what this means basically is we send whatever claims the current user has coming from the identity system, we send that to the authorization system, and you could create your own and have a user in any shape or form that you can pass in. But basically the claims on this user object will become the input to the claims transformation. Yeah? And what does this return? Roles and permissions. Okay. So now this here is the smart guy, right? You don't want to do a network round trip for every time you're calling this method. You want to do some caching, maybe more intelligent caching. Caching is you need to define basically how often do you anticipate your permissions to change, right? So if you say like, it's okay for me to cache my permissions for 10 minutes, but after 10 minutes you should get a new copy of that because maybe someone has changed the permission. Maybe in your system it says, yeah, we changed the permissions, maybe, not very often, so maybe caching for 1 hour makes more sense for you. Depends, right? But that is the job of the client library, so to speak, yeah? So in our view, in our secure view, you see basically we read the view data. Let me just grab that and do something like roles, permissions. Okay. So in other words, if I run that again and log in as Alice, I should see now Alice is in the doctor role, and based on the mapping, the permissions of a doctor are prescribed medication and perform surgery, right? Whereas if I'm Bob, I am a nurse, and I can still prescribe medication, but I'm a nurse, okay? And I guess if I log in as Brock, I'm a patient and I can request morphine, okay? So, and that's the primitive, so to speak, yeah? If you have that client library, you can write your code around that. That obviously means you have to start from scratch with a new application because obviously this becomes kind of like the, pretty much the backbone of your logic, right? So we have looked at other ways to integrate that into applications. The client library is the core maybe, but then there are other styles of authorization APIs for clients. So one that is wildly popular, which I don't like at all, is this style. Yeah, where you put the authorize attribute on top of your methods, and you put like roles equals doctor in there, and if you're a doctor, you can update the treatment plan, right? So who likes that style? Okay, who uses it? And who likes it? Okay? I think it's the worst thing ever. Sorry. Number one, what strikes me always is, why are .NET developers so crazy about attributes? I mean, it's code, right? It's code above the method name. What is different to code below the method name? Yeah? I don't get that. Maybe you can do reflection against that. I buy this argument, but no one ever does. Yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing I don't like about this style is that you have a tight coupling between your code and your authorization rules, right? That implies a couple of things. That implies that the developer at the time he writes that code already knows who will be allowed to call that code in production. I don't think that's true. That also implies that every time your authorization rules change, you need to update your code, right? So let's say for this particular method, you want to allow the doctor and, I don't know, someone else. So now you start going into your controllers and, type away on these magic strings. If you have, 5 controllers, that might be okay for you, but if you have 500, that's a different story, right? Make sure that whenever you do updates to your authorize attribute, you don't make a mistake, right? Because suddenly you have a security hole in your application. So I have customers who've written, we are all engineers, right? So we can write tools that update the authorize attribute in our code base to make sure we don't forget something, right? Or you become just a master in regular expressions. Also testing, how do you test that you have the right authorized attributes? What do? Like, to call every method over HTTP and make sure the right status code is coming back? Oof. Yeah. So, not a big fan of that. But as some people raise their hands, let's have a look how that would work. So basically, there's a technique called claims transformation. So the idea is that instead of calling this API explicitly, you turn it into middleware and run it in the pipeline implicitly. Yeah? Oh, and I have a non-fatal error. That's good. So we have this thing called app.use authorization provider. And what this will do basically is it will grab the authorization proxy from the DI container, call the method for the current user, and then whatever comes back, adds it to the claims principle, right? So if I compile that and log in again, and log in with Alice, you see now that in addition to having our explicit roles and permissions, you now see that the claims principle contains a role claim of doctor and 2 permission claims of prescribe medication and perform surgery. So what that means now is that you can write code like, like this. Home controller, let's do authorize roles equals doctor. Right? If that's your preferred way of doing it, and that means now that only Alice should be able to access that page. Right? And if I log in as Bob, who is a nurse, I get forbidden. Okay? That's, by the way, a subtle new feature in ASP.NET Core. I'm not sure if you know that in ASP.NET Core, they now have the notion of what is what does unauthorized mean for an anonymous user versus an authenticated user, right? So if I log in here and try to access the secure method, right? I am anonymous, and they bring me to the login page. So I log in with Bob. Now I'm authenticated and I'm trying to access secure, but I'm still unauthorized because I'm not a doctor, right? So they bring me to forbidden now. And that was something that you had to do manually in old ASP.NET applications, right? Because all they did in ASP.NET old, so to speak, was always send you to the login page, right? Because logging in again might solve the problem, right? It doesn't, typically. So that's quite cool. So if you haven't seen that, basically on the middleware in your pipeline, not this one, you can specify these 2 paths here, login path and access denied path, and then the middleware basically dispatches you based on your authentication status, so to speak, yeah? Okay. So yeah, where are we? Here. Okay, so if you like that, you can do that. I don't. What else can we do? In the new ASP.NET Core, there's a brand new authorization API. And has anyone ever used that or played around with that? It's been around since ASP.NET Core 1.0, right? That's 8 months or something. Do you know that they released 2.0 yesterday, yeah? So the backstory of that is that Brock and I have been working with the ASP.NET team for many years, and we always were unhappy with the authorized attribute, yeah? And we told them that for many, many years, and obviously they couldn't change it a lot because there was no opportunity to do breaking changes, but with ASP.NET Core there were plenty of opportunities to do breaking changes, yeah? So so basically we prototyped a framework for them, which was a prototype. It was okay. It wasn't really good. It lacked some of the features, but we showed it to them, and now with ASP.NET Core they took some of the inspiration from that and using it now. And the main point, my main point of improving the authorization attribute story is that I want to separate my code from the authorization logic. Okay, that is my main goal, yeah, because I don't like this tight coupling in a controller, and that's the main feature they did. Okay, it's extensible and so on and so forth. And by the way, funnily, the most common question I get when I show someone this new authorization framework is, that's cool. Is that available for MVC5? Because I don't do ASP.NET Core. Yeah, I'm doing Web API, and indeed, someone someone did the backport of that framework to version -1, so to speak. Yeah. Okay. So what does this look like? So they have this notion of a so-called authorization policy. And the idea is that in a central place in your application, you create so-called policies, and policies are a list of so-called requirements. Okay? So basically you can say, like, if you want to prescribe medication, you must be authenticated to start with, and then you need a permission called prescribe medication. Okay? Or whatever. You can basically extend the system in any way. The main point here is that the policy is being defined outside of the controller. Okay? So maybe even in a different assembly, maybe you pull in your policies via a NuGet package, for example. Yeah? So you can version them independently of the application. And if you change those policies, all of your controllers will automatically get the updated policy. Okay? So let's do that. Let's have a look how that looks like. So the way you do that is in your startup file. So the policies live, technically speaking, they live in the DI container. That's why you configure them from the configure services method. Obviously, you wouldn't put your policies in this class here, in this file. Yeah, that would be probably a bad style, especially if you have more than one. But you get the idea. You call it from here, so you can populate your DI container with that. And then I can go to my controller. And instead of doing this, I do this. Okay? And now basically what this means is if you want to access the secure method, you need to fulfill the prescribed medication policy. Yeah? Still an attribute, it's fine, but better than the other one above. Okay? So in other words, if I run that again, it behaves exactly like you would expect it to behave. Yeah? So if I'm a nurse, I can prescribe medication, but if I'm Brock, I can't. Okay? What I like a lot about this is that instead of doing it like that, you can also work with the policy system imperatively. Right? So it doesn't need to be an attribute. As we all agreed, now attributes are... Okay? So there's a service from Microsoft. It's called the Authorization Service. That comes part of their new authorization framework, right? And then you can do this. Okay? And then instead of doing, this here, you could be more imperative, yeah? Like you can say if, var allowed equals authorization.authorize async. You pass in which user you want to authorize against, and let's see, the name of the policy. Okay? And then if you want to have exactly the same logic as the attribute, you could say if this is not allowed, you return a so-called, and that's the new feature I just mentioned, a challenge. And this challenge is the thing that knows about, login versus forbidden. Yeah? Now, what does this enable you now? If you can call the policy system imperatively, what do you think? What excellent features your software could have by enabling that? One of that, yeah, but I think something completely different. You can unit test your policies now, right? Yeah, so you can basically write tests against your policy to make sure they actually do what they are supposed to do. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, if you're using this old style here, how do you test that this method is really secure? Right? You can't do that without doing, like a real HTTP request against it and make sure that the right status code is coming back for the right state you set up first. But here, you can write a unit test, make up whatever claims principle you want to make up, pass it into the policy, and make sure that, nurses should be allowed, patients shouldn't be allowed, right? And if someone along the line has to change the authorization requirements, and some other developer or yourself half a year later changes the policy, you can still make sure at check-in time that all the tests are still passing and you haven't by accident altered the policy in a way that it breaks the existing requirements, right? I like that a lot. Yeah? Obviously, also you're totally right. By having this Boolean now, you can have multi-level, requests and can maybe handle the failure code path differently than you would just do a redirect to a forbidden page, for example. Yeah, maybe you can recover from that in a way. Okay. Oops. Cool. So that's the new policy framework. So one thing about it, which obviously no one yet complained about, is, I should mention that's something that you can also do in ASP.NET Core. They now support dependency injection in views. So if you want to inject the authorization service into your view, you can call the policy system there as well. If you want to conditionally render your UI, for example, I'm not too excited about that, to be honest, yeah, because that basically makes you just write more code on your views, and your views basically shouldn't be another code file. My requirement, my advice would be, if you need to conditionally render UI, put it in a view model, right? But there is one point where I find this useful is on layout pages, right? Where you can't pass in a view model. So basically on a layout page, if you want to change your global navigation to whatever this guy is allowed to, that's a handy little tool in your tool belt. Okay? So the only thing I don't like about this approach so far is that now I have to, for every permission in my system, I have to create a policy, right? Which is kind of a bit awkward. Yeah? There's another nice feature in this system called the Policy Provider. And the idea is that you can create policies on the fly. Okay? So what we can do is, by implementing a custom policy provider, is that we can create these policies on the fly when they are needed. Yeah? So let me show you that. That's an example of a simple policy provider. So basically, they pass you in the name of the policy, like prescribed medication. Then what you can do is you first check, is there a statically defined policy with the same name? So that wins over a dynamically created one. And if not, you basically, call into the has permission API manually and return the status. So basically, in other words, now every permission in your system becomes implicitly a policy that you can program against. That's quite cool, right? So I like that. So how does that work? Basically, in here we have a little extension method, add permission policies, and what this does under the covers is it wires up this policy provider that we've written, and that has this logic I've just shown you. So in other words, in my startup, I can remove this now. Oops, not all of it. And my code will still work, right? Even if this policy is not defined now statically, I can create it on the fly. I also don't need this anymore here, because now I don't rely on the claims being present in the claims principle anymore. Yeah? And if I run that, it will still work. So Bob is allowed. Okay? Cool. So let's take this one step further. Custom requirements. Okay, so I said earlier, a policy is a list of requirements, and there are a couple of requirements that come from Microsoft, like the claim type requirement, and there's a role requirement, and so on. But you can extend the system with your own custom requirements. So maybe depending on which medication and the amount you're giving, the nurse or the doctor should be allowed or not, right? So there's probably a big difference between 5 units of morphine and 10, I assume, at least. So So what you can do is you can model these requirements as just data classes, and you implement this authorization requirement interface. And that's just a marker interface, so that in the DI container they find these things. And that's a bit of a cramped slide here, but to show you the idea is you're writing an authorization handler, and you're deriving from this T medication requirement base class. And then whenever somebody invokes a policy that contains this requirement, your handler will get called at runtime. And then you say, okay, if the client has the permission of prescribed medication, okay, that's the prerequisite. But now, if the amount is less than 10, okay, they all can do it, right? But if it's more than 10, it must be a doctor, unless it's a placebo, right? And then, we don't care, okay? And how you call that is basically by, you're newing up this requirement class, and then you're calling the authorization API, pass in the user, pass in the requirement. Your handler will get invoked at runtime. You will get back true or false, and based on that, you can make a decision. Okay? And obviously, since policies are a list of requirements, you can have more than one, and they all must agree on to each other, right? So if you have 5 requirements, 4 of them succeed, 1 fails, the policy will fail, right? So they all have to succeed, and that's what you do by calling context.succeed. If you don't call that, the default will be fail, which makes sense. Okay. How are we on time? That's good. So the last thing I want to show you is another feature they added in ASP.NET Core. Again, based on our feedback. And that is called resource-based authorization. And the idea is this. So far, policies only have 2 inputs, if you like. It's the identity of the user and the requirement, right? So what a policy doesn't have as an input is the resource this user is trying to manipulate. So let's say, for example, you want to have something like, this user can only delete a document if he's the owner of that document. Yeah, right? So basically, a third input comes in, and that is like, what is he trying to manipulate? Yeah? So in our context, the resource would be probably the patient, right? So let's say we have this. We have patients, and they have allergies to certain medication, right? So now you're asking yourself the question, is this nurse allowed to give 10 units of morphine to this patient, or is he allergic to it? Okay? And the way you can implement that is very similar to, you've seen the requirement. You have a handler, but you're taking into account the second input, which is the object or the resource that you're trying to manipulate in your application. Okay? In this case, it's an object called patient. Yeah? And then you do your logic, your medication requirement logic, and then at some point you basically say something like, if this patient has an allergy to the medication being subscribed, then this is not allowed. Yeah? And then you invoke it like you did before. You're creating a patient, setting the allergies, you're creating the medication operation, you're calling authorize async, you pass in all the 3 inputs, and you will get back a true or false. How do you like that? Okay, that's where I think it goes wrong, to be honest. You remember when at the beginning I talked about the blurry line between authorization and business logic? What do you think is that? This line of code here. Is that security, or is that core hospital software business logic? I think I heard business logic, right? Good. I would agree, right? So if you are a software company that writes hospital software, right, you're probably one of your main intellectual property, or like one of your main value propositions is that you have some logic that finds out if you prescribe aspirin to a person, if the person is allergic to any of the ingredients of the aspirin, for example, right? I mean, it's not as easy as saying, oh, he's allergic to aspirin. It's probably what's inside of it, yeah, or more complicated stuff. So I think, at least in this example here, you are probably already having a whole API or a whole business model around this question that I'm asking on this line of code, right? So I'm not sure if it makes sense to shoehorn that core business decision into an authorization policy. Yeah, you might disagree, and that's totally fine, because I'm on the fence as well sometimes. Yeah, so it's kind of like that's where it becomes really really interesting. But I still think if you are already that deep into your domain-specific logic, why would you turn everything into this Microsoft framework here of handlers and requirements and so on? You already have an API probably for that, right? I'm not saying it's a bad idea to separate the concerns. By all means, I would recommend that you separate the concerns of business logic and decisions and authorization into separate pieces. But I'm not sure if this particular framework is the right answer to that. Okay? I totally like the policy-based approach. That makes total sense to me. But once you are that deep into your own application, it feels a little bit like hexagonal. You have to use a framework to fit into the model, whereas not using the framework might be easier. Yeah? So that's my conclusion. So, our quest to start with was, can we write this authorization framework to rule them all? Like the one thing you need, and you're forever happy with your authorization decisions, and it's easy to use and all that. And I think the ultimate question is no, but that's a good thing, right? There are various decisions around authorization. Like one is, like, can you access the application at all? Yeah, this is typically done at the OAuth level even. Yeah, you're asking for an access token for API 1. You're not allowed to use API 1. You won't get it, right? If you're a user, the application says, okay, you are Dominic, but are you actually a user in my application? I totally get that. Once you are inside the application, you want to access a feature. I think this is where the roles and permissions model fits in really well, right? If you're a doctor, you're allowed to do this. Or if roles are too coarse-grained for you, then map roles to permissions. So fan out, basically, the different permissions. So you want to prescribe medication, you must have that permission for that. But once you are inside that feature, yeah, think of the allergic or the allergy problem. I think from that point on, it typically becomes application logic and not so much authorization anymore. So for me, my conclusion to the problem is typically authorization stops here at this boundary, and everything that's inside is mostly business logic, and there might be totally use cases, but this is not true what I'm saying. But for the most use cases I've seen so far, that's what I think it is. So I don't hope it's disappointing that I conclude my talk with this opinion. Yeah, I think it's a good thing because maybe it saves you some time trying to shoehorn this into an authorization logic. Yeah. So I think the main takeaways from this talk is even people like me that do security full time struggle with it. So don't feel bad if you struggle with that as well. And from all the scenarios I've seen, the common ground seems to be something like permissions and roles and maybe access control lists, things like that, but nothing more sophisticated. I think you're far better off if you have more sophisticated things than just can I do this and can I do that. I don't think you will do yourself a great favor of trying to fit into an existing framework. Write your own. Thank you. We have 1 minute left if you have any questions. Yeah? Oh. You mean like, is this user in the right tenant to that would be, for me, typically a front-end application concern, right? Your identity provider authenticates the user. He doesn't know specifically which tenant he's trying to access, but you typically would put a tenant ID into the identity token. So basically you burn in the tenant ID along with the other identity data with that user, and then wherever he presents that token, that system must make sure, hey, you are tenant 5, but you're trying to access tenant 3. That's not going to work. That's a policy, maybe. Yeah, but it's an application concern for me. Yeah. Okay. One more. Yes.
As a developer, when a security review comes in, they'll say, okay, let's run through all this API. Can you explain to me why you would authorize or not authorize?
Mm-hmm.
Does your framework presented how would you do that?
Okay, so the question is, so you want to basically annotate your policies? Yeah, that would be, I guess, we not the prototype, but it's a good idea. Thank you. So yeah, it would probably totally make sense to have an additional, field, say, why is this policy the way it is? And then maybe can even produce automated documentation from that. Would be great. Yeah, thank you for that idea. Cool, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.